Well, I think everybody is here. I'd like to welcome you all to the Money, Democracy, and Morality breakout panel. Let me quickly do something here on my phone. My name is Scott Ferguson. I am Associate Professor of Humanities and Cultural Studies at the University of South Florida. I have been charged with moderating this panel and also serving as a kind of commentator or discussant. I think what we will do is start with introductions. I've decided to introduce you all together at the top so we don't have to keep taking breaks. And then we'll sort of go in the order of the conference schedule. Each presenter will present for about 15 minutes. Some of the papers have been pre-circulated. Some of you may or may not have had a chance to look at them. You will certainly have a chance to do so later on. Those papers are longer than, of course, the remarks that can be offered here. And then after each presenter presents for about 15 minutes, I'll offer some brief thoughts and questions to the panel, and then hopefully that will just kind of open up a greater dialogue that we can and include you all in as we move toward the final, let's say, 15 minutes or so of this panel. So let me begin with some introductions. Our first presenter is Peter Dietsch. He is a philosopher and economist and a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Montréal. His research focuses on issues of economic ethics, notably on tax justice, normative dimensions of monetary policy, and on income inequalities. Dietsch is the author of Catching Capital, The Ethics of Tax Competition, Oxford University Press, 2015, co-author of Do Central Banks Serve the People, Polity Press, 2018, and co-editor of Global Tax Governance, What is Wrong with It and How to Fix It, ECPR Press, 2016. In 2017, Dietsch was nominated to the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists of the Royal Society of Canada. Our next presenter will be Ann Davis. Ann is Associate Professor of Economics at Marist College, author of The Evolution of the Property Relation, Palgrave, 2015, and Money as a Social Institution, Rutledge, 2017. She was director of an NEH Summer Institute on the Meanings of Property in 2014, and she has served as chair on the Department of Economics, Accounting, and Finance, and founding director of the Marist College Bureau of Economic Research. Jonathan Crock will be our third speaker. He is lecturer of government and international law at the College of William and Mary in Virginia and PhD candidate in international law at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Lastly, our fourth speaker is Maxximilian Seijo. He is a research fellow for the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He received a BA in economics from the University of South Florida and is currently finishing his master's thesis in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies at the University of South Florida. He's also a junior member of the Modern Money Network's Humanities Division Executive Committee and co-host of the Money on the Left podcast. His interests include critical theory, aesthetic modernism, and the history of full employment discourses. And with no further ado, I will pass things on to Peter. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for the organizers for this putting together this great event. So my goal in this paper is to reflect on the distributive dimensions of money creation. If you look at most contemporary theories of justice in political philosophy, they pretty much all agree that money matters from a distributive perspective, but they tend to take money as given. They neglect the fact that money is created by social institutions. And so my central claim in this paper is that the very process of creating this money is subject to a variety of biases. The core of this bias is relatively simple. When you go to the bank and you have collateral, you have an easier time getting credit than when you don't have collateral. And one of the things the paper does is to spell out this basic phenomenon in a variety of ways in a modern economy. So the basic structure of the paper is the following. I say something about the process of money creation. With this audience, I'm going to be very brief on that. I lay out the normative foundations or the normative assumptions from which I analyze the process of money creation. And then I will present 4 types of bias in our economy today where when money is created, certain individuals and certain groups get favored over others. Now, at that point, these are mere inequalities. And in the last step, I point to institutional alternatives, different ways in which we could create money. And once you put these in place, then you can actually claim that the way we're doing it today is unjust. So very briefly, a quick primer on money creation. So I distinguish 3 kinds of money in the paper. Currency, which I will actually not talk about today, and then deposits with commercial banks, and deposits with the central bank reserves. Now, how do these latter 2 kinds of monies get created? Well, it's relatively simple. You go to the bank as an individual, and you say, can I have a mortgage or can I have a consumption loan? And they will look at your financial portfolio, financial background, and if they like it, they press a button, and there is the money. Money is being created. In similar ways, central banks create central bank reserves vis-a-vis commercial banks, which those use to settle transactions with one another, or when more people than predicted come and want to withdraw their savings. Now, in normal times, the creation of these central bank reserves might not have a huge distributive impact, but as we've seen since the financial crisis, when central bank balance sheets ballooned, now this central bank money creation is actually significant, and therefore, as I will argue, also has distributive consequences. One last aspect about money that I want to highlight here is one that has been underlined by Katharina Pistor in her work, and that is the hierarchy of finance. So everyone but the state in our economy has to settle debts with higher order IOUs. If I owe someone money, I have to, if I don't have the cash to pay it, I have to go to a bank and get out a credit in order to settle it. The only entity that is above this logic is the state. So, what is the normative benchmark against which I want to evaluate the dynamics of money creation? In the paper, I actually talk about some of the theories of distributive justice that are out there and how you might use or might not use those. But the one that I end up choosing, and that's the only one I will set out here, is an approach by G.A. Cohen. And he basically tells us that money is freedom. Let's quickly read this quote. If A owns P and B does not, then A may use P without interference, and B will, standardly, suffer interference if he attempts to use P. But money serves in a variety of circumstances, and notably when A puts P up for rent or for sale, to remove the latter interference. So in other words, the argument I want to make is that the access to credit amplifies the relative freedom that is conferred by wealth, because it gives people access to more money. And if some have better access to this money, then we have a difference in relative freedom. And Cohen says the key truth is that if you're poor, you are por tanto less free than if you're rich. Now what I'm saying is that that phenomenon gets exacerbated if we have unequal access to credit. This, I suggest, is a relatively ecumenical way of thinking about it, because both people on the left and the right of the political spectrum, liberal egalitarians and libertarians, care about freedom. So they should all be concerned about some people having less freedom than others from this perspective. So against this background of what money creation is and the normative assumptions from which I want to analyze it, here's an overview of the 4 sources of distributive bias. Now this might be a little small, so down here we have consumers and firms, here we have commercial banks, and at the top we have the central bank. And I identify 4 processes in which money creation or money destruction, as we'll see in a minute, exhibits bias. So the first is the classic lending from commercial banks to either consumers or firms. The second is lending on the interbank lending market. The third is lending or creation of central bank reserves by the central bank for commercial banks. And the fourth is the reverse process. After these forms of money have been created, after a while they get destructed again. How do they get destructed? Well, in balance sheets, they disappear again, either when you pay your money back, when you pay your credit back, or when someone defaults. And that latter point is another instance of a distributive bias, I will argue, in money creation. So I will go through at least three of the. I think I'll probably leave out the central bank reserves case because it's relatively similar in structure to the interbank lending market. Let's start with the first one. So loans to non-banks. I've already said the basic argument here is relatively simple. Imagine two people, one owns a house that is worth $400,000 and the other owns a house that is worth $200,000. If the two go to the bank, then A enjoys twice as much freedom to obtain credit and do something with that credit than B. Now, of course, both have to pay their loan back, but in the meantime, A can invest this money and make twice the return compared to B. The same kind of argument holds for loans against income streams. Now, one important objection that I won't discuss the first one, but I'll concentrate on the important second one that I want to underline here is the following. Someone might say, you're right to point out that some people's freedom is enhanced more than other people's freedom, but you're overlooking the fact that by giving out this credit to some people, we're actually enhancing the freedom of everyone, because there is this trickle-down effect. When you have credit that is given out to the rich, they will invest it, and from this investment, not just they, but everyone will benefit. So my response to this comes in two ways. The first is to say, well, even if there is productive investment and there is this trickle-down effect, there is what we call the Contention effect. Those where the money was injected in the first place, and we talked about this morning already, benefit more than those who it trickles down to. But the more fundamental question is that actually what happens when credit is created in our economy? Does it actually go to productive investment? Again, we heard this morning, since the financial crisis, a lot of it hasn't. This is something that has been underlined by Adair Turner in his book. And so when the extra credit actually goes into existing assets, not only is there no trickle-down effect, but there is actually an additional bias in favor of those who already hold those assets. Right? So if since the crisis, a lot of the extra credit that's been created has gone into stock markets, housing markets, and art markets, one of the beneficiaries of this process are the people who are already in those markets. And so potential first-time house buyers and so on get priced out of the market. So that's an additional form of bias. So we can sum up and identify these three forms of bias in the basic case of loans to non-banks. Now, on the interbank lending market, there are some additional facets that we can add to this process. So whereas individuals have different objectives on what to do with the extra freedom that they get through credit creation, banks tend to have one single objective, and that is to make a profit. And over the last decades, they've discovered that on their balance sheets, they have sitting all this untapped collateral. And what have they done? Well, they've started to tap into this collateral. So they've taken all these things on their balance sheets and they've gone to other banks and said, hey, I'm going to give you this for 2 weeks if you give me some cash so that I can do something with it. One example for this is the repo market, which has, as many of you will know, taken on incredible proportions. So, thanks. LCH, ClearNet, one of the clearing houses in Europe, a few years ago cleared 11 trillion euros worth of repo market transactions with only government bonds per month. So it's a huge market, it's pro-cyclical, and it's just one example of interbank lending. Now, what are the distributive consequences of this interbank lending? I think we can identify three. First is, again, the Contention effect, so the phenomenon that the people where this money creation is injected, namely the financial sector, are the primary beneficiaries of this new money creation. Second, we have the same question as in the individual case, is there trickle down or is there not trickle down? If there is no trickle down, then again we have this additional bias in favor of asset holders, as in the previous case. Now, even with trickle down, we have an additional problem here, and that is the increased leverage, which makes the financial system more susceptible to crises, and we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this later. Now, the third, remember my my overview here. The third kind of money creation I will actually have to skip in the interest of time, and that is the creation of central bank reserves. I'll do some self-promotion here if you're interested in this. I also have a short new book with 2 co-authors about central banks, where we also talk about inequality. The distributive effects of this kind of money creation are actually relatively similar to what we see on the interbank lending market, right? With the one notable difference that I think we have several reasons to think that trickle down is particularly unlikely when central banks are created in this way. Let me switch instead to the fourth kind of bias, and that is different from the first three because it refers not to money creation but to money destruction. So as I already said, money can be destroyed again in 2 ways. Either people pay back their credit, and then on the balance sheets of the various parties in the economy we see that the balance sheet shrinks, or the counterparty defaults. Now, what does economic theory tell us about who central banks should let default? Well, the theory makes a distinction between a liquidity crisis and a solvency crisis. If an economic entity is merely illiquid, that means they just don't have enough assets short-term, but they would do long-term, then we should bail them out. If they're insolvent, if they can't meet their obligations even in the long-term, then we should let them fail. But what happens when you have too big to fail financial institutions? Well, central banks don't let them fail. They bail them out. And when they bail them out, we see another 2 instances of distributive bias. First, we have a selective protection of the freedom of systematically important banks. So they already benefited in the process of money creation. And now, because they're too big to fail, we're advantaging them again because we're bailing them out. And the second aspect of this distributive bias is that we're socializing private losses. How much time do I have left?
You have about, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes.
3 or 4 minutes? Okay. So, as I said, in order to show that these biases are not merely inequalities, but that are actually unjust, we need to go through one last step, and that is showing that there's alternative monetary arrangements for our economy which would reduce or even eliminate these biases. And so here in the paper I propose one more ambitious program and one more moderate program. The more ambitious program would, I argue, be able to eliminate some of the biases I've identified and mitigate one. And the more moderate program, macroprudential policies, would not eliminate any, but mitigate all of them a little bit. So let me say a few more words on those. Today, central banks basically need to pass through the commercial banking sector to conduct their monetary policy. Now, especially when there's no trickle-down effect, this puts price stability and financial stability at odds. Right? If you want to have a little bit more inflation, but the money is being spent on existing assets, then the liquidity you have to pump in to get the monetary policy you want is enormous. Now, if you separate money creation from credit, you could get around this problem. And one institutional arrangement that does that is 100% banking. So here, commercial banks are taken out of the money creation process altogether. They become mere intermediaries. And when you and I go to the bank, we basically say, either you keep this money like I would keep it under my pillow, or you invest it for me under an equity contract rather than under a debt contract. Now, this kind of admittedly radical reform would get rid of 3 of our biases that we've identified above. There would no longer be any advantages to the commercial banking sector because they wouldn't have the right to create money anymore. There would also no longer be advantages to the holders of existing assets because we wouldn't have these speculative bubbles anymore. And finally, because we have fewer speculative bubbles, there would also be less bias in the bailouts because, again, there would be less need for those. the one single advantage of that we couldn't get, or the one single distributive bias that we can't get rid of, is the fact that people with more collateral would still be able to get better access to loans. But that's one out of several biases that I have identified. Again, the more moderate strategy in here, you could think of raising reserve requirements, regulation of shadow banking, financial transaction tax, all kinds of things that we have been and will be discussing over the next couple of days. You could use those to mitigate the distributive biases that are inherent in the money creation processes in our economies today. So to conclude, the creation of the very thing that makes us rich, money, is biased in favor of some economic agents in our society. So if some people think that you have these entitlements to the things that you produce with your labor, they should be upset about this, because there are some people who benefit without having done anything for this benefit. If you accept the normative premise, if you accept that money confers freedom, then this inequality in access to credit is potentially problematic. And given that we have institutional alternatives that will allow us to reduce these distributive biases, we can actually make the step from diagnosing inequalities to diagnosing an injustice. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. So I'll give you a sign when it's 10 and you've been 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. To the organizers, to you, and to the panelists. So I have presented this material in the goal of providing a critique. So rather than assume what money is, I'm trying to say how money evolved historically by looking at the institutions, legal and financial. And so my basic goal is critique, but like, where did money come from? What does it do? How did it get there? But I'm using institutional history. And so this, as you'll see in a minute, is a short, kind of preview of some material that I've written more about. But for this conference in particular, I thought it would be useful to quote Christine Desan. So she points out in her book, Making Money, a very interesting switch. So money creation was done by the sovereign, and the sovereign could charge for that privilege. It was a service he did. But in the modern liberal state, money creation is something that institutional investors are paid to do. And she asked the question, why is there that switch? And so it seems to me that there's a couple of different ways to read this. One is there's complementary between the wealth holders and the state. So the modern liberal state is forward-looking and depends on the wealth holders to create wealth. Another interpretation, which I'll quote a little bit more later, is that there's an exploitive relationship between the state and the public, and that the wealth created is done by the public at large, and the returns to that wealth is taken, again, by the wealth holders, by their privilege of charging interest. And so that's a basic question I want to ask. And so in assuming that money is social, there's several resources on which to draw, and I'll just kind of list these. And so today there's a lot of people who say money is social, but there's still not much agreement on what functions, what role money performs. And again, I go into more detail on this in my book. Okay, but so I would start with the structure of the modern liberal state. And here, the medieval state, of course, would have tax farms or would borrow money from private financiers. But the liberal state internalizes the function of money. And so we have the formal state apparatus, the private sphere, and the public sphere. And so the private sphere is the firm and the household, and the public sphere is the official state. And in between that is the civil society. So the liberal state internalized the public finance function by taxing, right? And so rather than borrow money from the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, the Barings and the Morgans, the liberal state makes a contract, and we've heard some about this today. I will tax you, and then you are the beneficiary of the state functions that are supported with that tax. And so, but the functions that were performed were military. And so the states at this time were competitive, states competing to expand markets for their own domestic wealth holders. And so it seems to me that that function has remained, that one important function of taxes in the modern liberal state, which I would argue we still have today, is tax to support the military. And the military is to expand the state and to create wealth. Even in economics, mainstream economics, everyone assumes defense is a public good, period, no question. And so I would argue that defense is still the purpose, it's still competitive capitalist, and that the function of the state then is to raise taxes to support that function. And we, the taxpayers, would then say, oh, of course we want secure borders, oh, of course we want to be the greatest state in the world economy, we want to be the empire, sometimes explicitly as a goal. And so this public finance is rooted in the military, it's rooted in the bureaucratization of finances, and it's also in the professionalization of the military, which used to be the citizen militia or the mercenaries. And so I see the modern liberal state as formed by the internalization of these functions, which have become invisible. So then another reason I want to do the history is to make these original founding contracts more visible. Okay, so in reviewing this, I would argue that the financial revolution can be traced historically, and that after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where the Bank of England was founded based on a deal, which is now well known, we also had what's called the kind of a big bang in the 1720s, when and this is again the UK state, internalized finance by these major corporations, merchant monopoly corporations, that then were used to finance the state. So the state would give the corporations a monopoly on certain kinds of trade, and then give those corporations the ability to hold public debt as a financial asset, which then they could issue stocks and then have their colonial operation. In the meantime, and especially with the Bank of England, one of the privileges was the issue of currency. But this was the privileges of the merchant monopoly corporation, which again seems to be already in the beginning an expansionary goal of the liberal state. It wasn't just freedom, it was power and financial power. And so one of the things that I would claim is really important, that we, the taxpayer, fund the public debt, and the public debt is still the foundation of the private financial system. So the safe asset we've heard about, the safest asset is U.S. Treasury bonds. It's safe because U.S. taxpayers pay taxes. And the U.S. state that has been founded has been an expansionary state, which can then borrow money and pay it back because of its world military and economic power. And so the story I would tell is the state has been a way to consolidate what started out as merchant monopoly corporations, but then merged into private business corporations. Okay, so on this slide and the next one, I want to contrast how different people have interpreted, you could say, spin. So in other words, the Revolution of 1688 is famous, right? But what do North and Weingast say about it? Well, it was protection of property rights, it's a balance of power, and this is freedom because the state has committed to protecting property rights. That's on the left. On the right, Marx would claim the whole country, the wealth of the whole country is backing the bank. And the taxpayers, the gold supply, the whole public debt supports this bank. And so look on the bottom right, public debt becomes the credo of capital, and you dare not question the public debt. And again, can you read the top quote without slipping? So is there anything more absurd, for instance, in the Bank of England, whose notes have credit only thanks to the state, taking payment from the state, from the public, in the form of interest on government loans for the power granted to it by the state to transform these same notes into money and then lend it back to the state? And so, the ironic comment from Marx is this is circular, and the bank is charging the state for privilege that it has been granted by the state. And Christine Desan, one of our founders of this wonderful conference, claims and argues that money no longer appears as a public resource. It looks like an arrangement between individuals. And here she's interpreting Locke, that it wasn't the state, it was just private individuals who make a convenient deal that this is money. Okay, so one point, let me just summarize so far. One point is to look at the history of the liberal state to understand what money is. Second point is to look at the different interpretations that are possible from this arrangement. A third point that I would like to make is that what we consider the importance of the public and the private spheres really gets reversed. So in Aristotle and some of the civic republican tradition, it's the public sphere where we are most human. We are political animals, we engage in rational debate, and this is freedom. Freedom is in the public sphere. But once you have a state based on taxes, then the state is coercive and forces you to pay taxes. And so the state becomes the bad guy. And then you have freedom in the private sphere where you have individual consumer thrills, right? And so the freedom is an individual freedom isolated from all other people instead of, let's say, what used to be considered the fulfillment of human nature, which is the political animal and the rational debate and the coming together and the discussion and collaboration. And so I think the liberal state presumes freedom, but in fact we've split now. What used to be freedom in the public sphere is now coercion, and some thinkers like Isaiah Berlin and others would say, no, freedom is really in the private sphere as isolated individuals. Okay, so I think that whole structure, that whole interpretation of the state as the bad guy is unfortunate. And it also hides the idea that the public really is the power behind the money, right? If it weren't for we, the taxpayer, public debt would have no liquidity. It would not be the safest asset in the entire world. And if you ask a taxpayer in the United States, where does wealth come from, they would never say, we the taxpayers. And so I think this whole rhetoric of the private sector as the wealth creators has really reversed what you might argue is the institutional structure. Okay, so again, I have a few brief slides on the fact that the public is the backer of the currency, right? And so the liability for the public is the asset for the state, and the asset for the public is a liability for the state. That is, you could say that money is circular. And let me skip quickly a little bit. This is the familiar slide of the circular flow diagram, which is supposed to be an equilibrium, supply and demand are equal. I would translate it back into an accumulating relationship, cyclical. So starting at the top, public debt is the safe asset. It still backs the shadow banking sector. And from public debt, you can issue notes, what we call the dollar, is Federal Reserve notes, which is the liability of the Fed, based on really the liability of the taxpayer. And then from those Fed notes, the US dollars, that's where the private credit is created, loaned to the corporation, realized after production and sale, paid back in taxes, and then forms the public debt again. And so essentially, again, we, the taxpayer, are the backers of the state and the wealth. Okay, so when I say money is social, I would argue that it's social in this particular way, that the national currency is the symbol of the whole nation state. Yes, money represents purchasing power, it represents freedom, as we've just hold, but it's a collective power, right, which is interpreted as individual. And without the backing of the public, the financial system would not be as resilient as it is. And so again, let me just say in terms of our contemporary period, if I've persuaded you that the US Treasury bond is the safest asset in the world, depends on we the taxpayers, then it turns out that because of people's antipathy towards the state as the coercive taxing authority, we may have less support. So these populist, sectarian, secessionary types of movements are questioning loyalty to the state, and yet that's where our entire financial system resilience depends on, is the US taxpayers and the taxpayers' willingness to pay into the power of the US government, for example. So I think without recognizing the public, I think we undo the solidarity and the recognition that ultimately may undo the resilience of the debt. And so let me stop there and look forward to comments.
Hi everybody, I'm Jonathan Crock and I teach at the College of William & Mary, and thank you all for coming out today. My talk today is about the human right to democratic control of money. And this conference is an exciting discussion of reimagining money as a democratic medium. At the same time that we reimagine money, I'm going to argue that we also need to reimagine what democracy and to be democratic means. Money as a democratic medium has 3 levels of meaning. The first level is the understanding that money is a public good. And we've heard a lot about that today, and you're very much well aware of this. Money is a creation of public law. It is a creation of the people. Banks are not truly private entities, but are franchises licensed by the government to create money that is backed by the government, that is the people. This is the first sense of money as a democratic medium. The second level of money as a democratic medium is that the public good of money should be used for democratic purposes, for the benefit of the people as a whole, and not for oligarchic or narrow elite interests. Money should not be used to increase inequality, but should be used democratically for the benefit of society as a whole. Under the second meaning of money as a democratic medium, elected elites and technocrats should seek to implement policies such as public banking for all, a Green New Deal, and so we've heard a lot about the Green New Deal that would print public money to provide a job guarantee for all, with a focus on socially beneficial green work. Other policies include free higher education for all, eliminating the student debt of all and making it free, and a host of other kinds of policies. These all would serve to have money be a truly democratic medium. Yet even this democratic money at the second level, which would be a tremendous success and is something that's urgently needed, is still controlled by elected elites, whether at the national, state, or municipal levels, wherever money is operating, and also by technocrats. And such a system is reversible by future elites, as the New Deal of the past was undone. We also need to avoid the structural racism and sexism of FDR's New Deal. So how do we get past these inherent problems at this level of democratic money? And how do we cement in place democratic money so it can't be undone? How can we make the Green New Deal cemented in place so it can't be undone like the previous New Deal? So how do we accomplish this? We need a third level of money as a democratic medium. The third level of money the third level of meaning of money as a democratic medium is having actual democratic control of money, putting control of money into the hands of the demos, the people. All money is the people's money, as we've heard repeatedly, yet the people have never had control over their own money. In discussing money as a democratic medium, we need to rethink not only what money is, but what we mean by democracy. What would money as a democratic medium look like in this third sense of the phrase? I argue that it would be giving control of money to a citizens' assembly. A citizens' assembly is a randomly selected body of citizens with power over public policy that hears from and is advised by experts, but where citizens themselves have final binding power. The use of citizens' assemblies has been growing rapidly, and it's just starting. Some people have heard about it already. Others are just starting to hear about it now, but there's all kinds of examples of this growing globally. Today, I'm just going to mention 2 brief examples. Iceland followed the US in deregulating the financial industry, helping to lead to a systemic collapse of Iceland's economy and the global financial crisis. In the face of a popular uprising, Iceland began a process to draft a new constitution. So here's an opportunity to basically recreate society from scratch with a brand new constitution. As one step in this process, 950 Icelanders were randomly selected to help draft this new constitution. This is a citizens' assembly. When you randomly select a citizens' assembly, you automatically get 50% women's participation, and not just wealthy women, but women drawn from a cross-section of socioeconomic groups. You also get equitable minority representation. Everyday citizens have shown themselves fully capable of hearing from technical experts, deliberating, and arriving at policies that best benefit the community as a whole. In the Iceland experiment, which was successful, the Iceland constitution drafting process represented the first time in modern human history that women had 50% of the decision-making seats in drafting that constitution. This is actually in one stage of the drafting process. There were other stages beyond that, but in this particular stage is what I'm interested in. As a second example, Ireland recently used a citizens' assembly of 99 randomly selected Irish citizens to address the existence of a constitutional ban on abortion. Existing elites and the Constitution had a ban on abortion. This did not match what citizens as a whole wanted, and so this issue was kicked to a citizens' assembly. These randomly selected citizens heard from experts of all kinds. They heard from religious experts, technical experts, scientific experts, other kinds of ethics experts, other non-experts, NGOs. They deliberated over these different recommendations, and they came up with a constitutional amendment that was adopted in a national referendum to legalize abortion in Ireland. And Ireland has gone on to do this on issues of climate change and other issues. Control over the money supply should be given to a citizens' assembly. This statement likely provokes fear amongst some. As Randall Wray writes regarding critics of modern monetary theory, there is a fear that if you tell policymakers and the general public how things work regarding money as a public good, democratic processes will inevitably blow up the government's budget as everyone demands more from government, end quote. There is a fear that everyday citizens are too incompetent, too irresponsible, too backward to have power over what we've heard today is their own money. This fear is reminiscent of colonial arguments of why certain populations are not fit to govern. Citizens in a citizens' assembly, as has been empirically shown in numerous citizens' assemblies conducted worldwide, are actually more responsible, more reliable, and better at developing policies that benefit society as a whole than either elected elites or technocrats. Citizens' assemblies given power over money combines democratic control of money, that is money as a democratic medium at this third level of meaning, with you still have technocrats and experts advising the citizens on the best policies to pursue. So you have the best of both worlds. You still have the expertise of people like the experts who you've heard from today, and then you're combining that with real citizen control. And as has been seen, and when this is actually conducted around the world, citizens actually do listen to experts and come up with what is the best policy for society as a whole. Additionally, I argue that citizen assembly control of money is not only the best public policy, but is a human rights requirement. Human rights law requires gender parity in decision-making, meaning women have 50% of the power over all decision-making. It requires equitable minority participation. It requires equitable participation of all socioeconomic classes and a host of other marginalized groups that need to be brought into power. Let's look at the composition of the Federal Reserve Board, just for comparison to this kind of human rights legal requirement and this human rights ideal. Looking at all new members appointed to the Federal Reserve Board since 2000, so this is everyone in the 21st century, 71% have been male, and out of all new members appointed since 2000, 100% have been white. While, of course, people of color in the United States make up approximately 40% of the US population. Additionally, all members of the Federal Reserve Board come from upper class socioeconomic background. This is just one example of a host of countless examples you could give across society. And when you look at so-called private banks, when you look at Congress, when you look at other institutions of power over money, they're basically just as bad. Legislative, executive, central bank, and private bank control of money needs to be democratized, and the way to do this is via citizens' assembly. There will still be economists and other experts to advise citizens' assembly on the best monetary and fiscal policies, and citizens have proven themselves fully capable of following good advice when it is in the best interest of society. The people should finally have control over their own money. It is their human right. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to my fellow panelists. So in my paper, The Unnatural State, Money and Propaganda After New Deal Liberalism, I trace the perceived opposition between money and democracy to the discursive contexts of the American New Deal and the World War II mobilization. As a figure whose political theory I argue informed these discourses, John Locke wrote in his 2 treatises of government that all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the laws of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. I write this paper in opposition to this ontological conception and articulate the deployment of these ideas in the mid-century context as a precursor to neoliberalism's deployment of rhetorical tropes surrounding the invisible hand of a neutral or free marketplace. Further, I draw together two discourses, which both are influenced by Locke's notion of individual will or consent as the creative force behind governance. These discourses are economics and social psychology. I do this to destabilize the notion that activist governance represents a public, quote-unquote, intervention into supposedly private spheres. Instead, I insist that legal mediation is perpetual and ongoing, and what matters is not the preservation of Locke's notion of freedom in nature, but rather a broader democratic political subjectivity which centers around monetary mediation. Of the supposedly interventionist state policies of the 20th century, the New Deal resonates today as perhaps the most important. It was created to curb the most devastating effects of the Great Depression. It initiated an unprecedented level of state intervention into American life. So the story goes. Paradoxically, however, Roosevelt framed this supposed intervention as lacking any intervening properties. He saw political risk in calling for state control. In his May 7, 1933 radio address, titled Outlining the New Deal Program, he insisted that the government was not taking control of organized private industry, but that the policies were rather a partnership between industries and central authorities. In insisting on this partnership, Roosevelt demonstrated to the public that he believed the market to be a natural Lockean formation, what Friedrich Hayek would later describe as the market's spontaneous order, even if, unlike Hayek, he insisted the market required substantial government regulation and support. As the historian Alan Brinkley has chronicled, somewhat problematically, by the later stages of the 1930s, Roosevelt's outward-facing insistence that the New Deal was a public-private partnership could not be sustained. By the later stages of the New Deal, quoting Brinkley, virtually all the New Dealers agreed that a solution of the nation's greatest problems required the federal government to step into the marketplace to protect the interests of the public. In other words, Brinkley, in addition to the New Dealers, thought that the policies of the New Deal, quote-unquote, imposed order on a disordered economic world, as the economy of capitalism could not stand on its own. Whether through denial or affirmation of the state's role in the New Deal economy, this liberal frame obscures the state's role in perpetuating the basis of the marketplace through money, with its insistence on man and market's state of nature. In its false affirmation, however, it frames the New Deal as a never-before-seen intercession of the state into the supposedly free and private affairs of the American public. As a result of this framing, and in the context of the rise of militant fascism in Europe, even some pro-New Deal liberals began to question the state control of the economy as reminiscent of rising European totalitarianisms. Brinkley argues that liberals who had once admired the collective character of some European governments looked with horror at the totalitarian state America was now fighting and saw in them a warning about what an excessively powerful state could become. He also went on to claim that the war seemed to demonstrate that the route to full employment was not state management of capitalist institutions, but fiscal policies that would promote consumption and thus stimulate economic growth. This sort of anxiety over state influence mirrors a concurrent intellectual and aesthetic movement's consideration of government influence upon the public. But instead of economic influence, they documented the effects of mass media propaganda. Fred Turner names this movement the democratic surround and argues that figures involved with this movement, like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, had tremendous influence in intellectual policy circles. By 1938, Turner argues that virtually all agreed mass communication could turn the individual personality and with it the structure of society as a whole in a totalitarian direction. Implicit in this example of the democratic surround's anti-fascism is a psychological state of nature, a state in which the mind of an American is chaotically free and ready for the ordering force of fascist manipulation. Whereas I would disagree and assert that the American mental perspective is never formed in a vacuum, but alongside political, economic, and social experiences that are conditioned by their respective points of view. In other words, it is formed alongside the material and immaterial experiences of government's perpetual monetary influence. In 1941, the cadre of academics and policymakers which informed the democratic surround delivered a report to President Roosevelt's to President Roosevelt as members of the Committee on National Morale, which I argue reflects and informs policy on war information, but also Roosevelt's approach to wartime production. This can be seen in the cost-plus contracts of the war mobilization, which guaranteed supposedly private corporation rates of profit for war production. My contention here is that this decision reflects a broader waning of the New Deal consensus around the state's role in the economy, reminiscent of what historical sociologist Jakob Feinig, who's here with us today, calls the monetary silencing of this era. It demonstrates the paradoxical circumstance in which neo-chartalist or constitutional understandings of money were mobilized as public-private partnerships under the terms of American liberalism's Lockean assumptions about a private economic sphere, which almost predestines the breakup of institutional liberalism later in the 20th century. Aside from the generally flawed framework surrounding state intervention, there are specific hints of this ontological failing in the throes of New Deal public intervention. In 1935, Congress approved the passage of the Patman-Greenback Bonus Bill, which would have awarded bonuses to veterans as early payments for their benefits. However, Roosevelt vetoed the bill, emphasizing the threat of inflationary chaos if a particular group successfully pressured Congress into creating money. Roosevelt saw the public pressure surrounding the bill as a threat to his control of money creation. His position demonstrates a central paradox of Lockean-informed governance. Absolute authority is tenuous because it is seen as an arbitrary projection of individual will or consent, and not ongoing collective legal mediation. Feinig describes Roosevelt's veto calculus in these nightmarish terms. He writes, FDR evoked the threat of a monetary state of nature, a nightmare in which group after group pushes for money creation on its own behalf, and the monetary order disintegrates as cash becomes worthless, just like in Weimar Germany. I suggest here that this anti-democratic, anti-inflationary argument will be inverted into a bad faith, anti-authoritarian opposition to fiscal aspects of state intervention in the neoliberal era, but only because it was based on a false assumption that the market and further the minds of the American people were a blank slate, ripe for the state's interceding anti-democratic presence in mass media forms like money or even the government press release. From this perspective, conceptions of information dissemination during the war changed shape. In 1942, only months after the Committee on National Morale presented its findings to the president, Roosevelt reorganized the disparate war information agencies under a single office known as the Office of War Information, or OWI. Instead of the neutral dissemination of quote-unquote facts and figures, which was the old policy under the Office of Facts and Figures, OWI was tasked with achieving an approach to information issuance that attempted to walk the line between neutrality and effectiveness. In other words, OWI was given a little bit more space to lie about government activities. This received some pushback from within the military. General Dwight D. Eisenhower voiced this opposition, and in a letter to the director of OWI, Elmer Davis, wrote, "We must maintain our policy of objectivity. Our job is to promote an understanding of policy, not to make policy." This approach, which somehow imagined that monopolistic public issuance of information about the war could be neutral, is not only mistaken, but a sentiment which would arise later in free market discourses, which insisted on the government's role in not making policy, but mere objective adjudication of the supposedly free affairs of the marketplace. As well, this insistence on propagandistic neutrality is useful for understanding the perpetual influence of legal media on the public. Just as money perpetually organizes all production, a fact which is obvious in the context of World War II, legal mediation of information, whether through the networks of distribution or the information itself, is always influencing public discourse. From here, we can begin to break through the Lockean teetering between freedom and authoritarianism and imagine the democratic potential of perpetual monetary mediation. But before I get to that, I want to drive home a historical point about OWI's propaganda and monetary issuance. John Morton Blum, a cultural historian of this era, affirms Eisenhower's insistence on OWI's neutrality by pointing out that, and I quote, "OWI itself, as Eisenhower understood it, had no mandate from Congress or the President to undertake to define the purpose of the war or to try and sell its definition. Indeed, its mandate as an issuing mechanism was far from clear." Blum's framing of the necessity of congressional mandate for issuance draws together these two seemingly distinct registers of governing mediation under the auspices of the general category of government influence and communication. When we envisage money and press releases together as media for such influence, we can begin to see how Locke's philosophical influence during the war enabled the persistence of a void between governance and social subjectivity that would lead to abandonment in neoliberalism, leaving monetary issuance to quote-unquote private banks and information issuance to quote-unquote private media actors. In the anxiety about issuance displayed by Eisenhower, we can see how collective provisioning waned in importance to assertions of Lockean neutrality and freedom. Drawing together these registers also shows how the Roosevelt administration's earlier rejection of populist monetary creation through congressional issuance was inverted from a concern over democratic influence to a concern over anti-democratic propagandistic influence in OWI, all while monetary issuance was itself totally organizing American affairs, as it always does. Most importantly, these paradoxical inversions are premised on Lockean assumptions of the possibility of free neutrality in the first place. This leads to the post-war era, where the banishing of productive responsibility to the supposedly private sector enables the disruption of the economy in the 1970s, when the faux neutrality of the tax cuts and fiscal lubrication supposedly stops working. The result of this is, of course, neoliberalism, which doubles down on the Lockean assumptions that condition this chaotic outcome. Of course, in the real world, doubling down on this Lockean freedom mandates the heavy hand of the totalitarian government, which neoliberal thinkers such as Hayek variously conceded and avowed. This totalitarianism took the form of the racist, anti-democratic disenfranchisement of millions during the war on drugs and crime, often while utilizing the public-private partnerships that Roosevelt insisted define the New Deal. To extend what has been noted by David Stein and others, neoliberalism marginalizes full employment and justice movements through its obsession with austerity and budget surpluses by solving the problem of unemployment with a deployment of Lockean freedom that mandated authoritarian imprisonment at the level of policy. This brutal reorganization of social life represents the conclusion of liberal divestment from policies of economic governance out of the fear of fascist totalitarianism, a fear which ultimately manifests in a propagandistic totalitarianism of its own. Taking this all into account, we can now consider that money can be conceived of as democratic only after we divest from the Lockean assumption of the state of nature. We can do this by framing money's origin and function as predicated upon the abstract legal connections that mediate all commerce, production, employment, and information dissemination. No longer must we conceive state mediation as teetering into and out of the free private sphere, sometimes leaving authoritarian scars that abridge our supposed freedoms. With neo-chartalism and constitutional money at hand, we can now say that money is always governing social interaction. And as a result of this reconstitution of money's origin and function, we are now tasked with asking not if money can be democratic, but rather how should we mobilize money to maximize its perpetual democratic potential.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for such rich and interesting papers. I'm seeing a lot of convergences, a lot of overlaps, potentially some tensions around questions of freedom, the relationship between public and private. There were a lot of, I think, interesting meditations on the role, the historical and changing historical role and relationship between war and money. And I'm kind of curious to see where a dialogue about these different issues might take us in the next 20 or so minutes. But I want to say a few things about the topic that sort of is supposed to be orienting this panel, but I would say has been pushed into the background, maybe in an implicit way. So the title of the panel, if we all remember, is Money, Democracy, and Morality. And I think that a lot of powerful moral arguments and claims have been put forth here, but maybe not thematized as such and using moral language. And by way of maybe getting us going in our Q&A and conversation, I want to suggest that maybe it's worthwhile to start thinking about developing a moral language around money. And one of the major reasons we need to do this is because it is sorely lacking, especially in the contemporary context. And I would say that there are two reasons, primary reasons for this, and I would say that the right, center, and left are all variously guilty. So the two reasons I would say is, first is our liberal and now neoliberal hyper-reduction of the monetary relation to a private instrument and a private relationship. The public disappears. Even sort of, leftists who want to sort of claim a place for the public, they tend to other the money relationship as sort of belonging to capital, belonging to private money claims that might be backed by a public state, but that's about it. And so the kind of center of causality is as we heard in an earlier panel, it is the private actor as the prime mover of the world. So what ends up happening there? Then we take various kind of moral responses to this reduction, and we say, maybe we're sort of good liberals, and we say, it's okay. There's some excesses. Maybe we have a few regulations in here, and everything will be fine. The further left we go, we decry what's going on here with monetary relationships, and really the whole money relation as such is pitted against the moral sphere. And you see this tension beginning in John Locke, and actually earlier as well, where John Locke has to be thinking about drawing on the tradition in which he was working, British sentimentalism, moral philosophy, moral theory, where he has to start theorizing these natural sentiments that, fellow feeling toward other humans, for him men, and that was somehow going to kind of temper the self-seeking, self-interested bourgeois individual in his private monetary goings-on. Then you have 19th century socialists, and of course Karl Marx, suggesting that money is really, it's not just kind of not moral, it's the essence of immorality. Right? It is the evacuation. It is the universal force of alienation in modernity. So I think drawing on, a lot of the impulses in these papers, the constitutional theory of money, the neo-chartalist theory of money that puts money as ontologically and topologically as a public good at the front and center of our analysis and our politics. I think it's imperative that we develop a language, a set of metaphors, a grammar of morality that is irreducible to private commerce and how it might be controlled or made nice or destroyed. You see examples of this all the time. Just looking through my social media feed in the last couple of days while thinking about this, I saw yet again an advertisement for Paul Krugman's new master class, in which he says, economics, it's really just about people. It's not about money. Right? What is he doing? He's making a moral claim, and he wants to say, this is very Adam Smith. At the end of the day, we're just people getting along, and we can have a kind of mutual, nice relationship to one another. And money is this sort of incidental thing, and don't take it too seriously. So I think that the chartalist approach and the constitutional approach says, no, money is a public social relationship which mediates our interrelationships, our production, our distribution, our sense of participation and exclusion at a macro scale. And we need a language for that, and we don't have it. Another example I've come across several times recently is a book by a Harvard professor named Michael Sandel, whose very title bespeaks this kind of, these kinds of logics. What money can't buy, the moral limits of markets, right? So morality begins where markets stop, and markets equal money, full stop. So I want to say, and I think a lot of us are at this conference, money is public. And when we erase that, we let ourselves off the hook morally and in terms of our collective imagination. And I think we need to, it's urgent to develop a positive, plural, rich moral language around money and social provision. So that's where I'll stop, and I'll open it up for questions. Gentlemen?
So I have three things, beginning with morality and money. I think that a lot of the conversation here has been about John Locke, the way that you did. I would like to draw your attention to John Maynard Keynes. And I think the ambiguity about these questions of morality really begin with Keynes. Keynes has been adopted by people of all kinds of stripes as proposing a kind of a technocratic approach to full employment. But sometimes pretty awful people have adopted Keynes, including Hjalmar Schacht, who was one of Hitler's main economic policy person. So, and I think the problem in Keynes is the fact that it was a very technocratic way of bringing about full employment. And I think we need to be extremely careful in using Keynes because there was no power in them. I understand that question is kind of central to our issue here. So I have three on that, on the basis of that, I want to say three things. One, on Anne, I've taught and read Marx for a long time since grad school. I think that there's a contradiction in volume 1 between what he writes at the end, where he's talking about the legal and political foundations of the economy, and his theory of money at the beginning, which is virtually the Austrian theory of money, right? And now I got my PhD at the New School, so so that's a pretty. We can talk more about this, but I've become very disillusioned with that. So I don't think Chris's approach would be consistent with that commodity theory of money that Marx has. On Jonathan, I agree with the kind of proposals you've made, but I think there's one issue that I've been troubled with all along, not with regard to you, but these economic experts that we see in this world around us, right? These are all neoclassical economists. And unfortunately, they dominate the conversation, which means that there's no way, unless we make a new kind of left politics really breaks through that, right? That we're going to bring in these kinds of questions of power and morality in. Yeah, that's it.
So, I'm thinking, can we answer a little bit and then go back to questions? I kind of prefer that format if everybody's okay with that. Anne, did you want to speak to that?
Well, sure. So, interpreting Marx, how easy. Just like really quickly, I don't see the first part of Volume 1 as Austrian. I see the first part of Volume 1 as leading to an analysis of exploitation of labor, and that labor is the true...
I mean, just the money part,
Yeah, but the money part, I would argue, is connected to the analysis of the exploitation of labor, so that may be why we're interpreting it differently. And so the first part of Volume 1, discussing money, I see as labor as underlying the exchange equivalence, and then later on, the public as supporting the institutional foundations that enable the state to be both a dominant colonial power and a domestic control of labor. So that's where I think we disagree.
Okay, next question. Yeah.
Hello. I was just on a question of liberty in John Locke. I was wondering, in the recent, well, not very recent, but in the rise of like neo-fascist movements in Europe. I think some of you mentioned that. I was wondering how much does that correlate to the failure of neoliberalism, liberalism in general, to realize the freedom, to realize, to work for everyone, particularly the working class.
Yeah, so I think I can also address Jamé's question about Keynes as well in this question. So I mean, I think there is a direct line between the neoliberal divestment or further divestment from the question of social and ongoing mediation and dealing with morally what it means that the public is constantly mediating all aspects of life. And so, yeah, I mean, the solution in my mind, and this is something that I'm continually thinking about, and it's part of an ongoing project, is to sort of attempt to redefine and rethink about how we define freedom in a way that isn't it's not always a process of getting away from a mediation which you can't get away from, but rather a way of flourishing and being taken care of by that mediation. And so what I would say then to Jamé's question about Keynesianism, or Keynes broadly, the technocratic nature of Keynes, the same thing that powered the Third Reich was what defeated the Third Reich. It was full employment. And so in the sense that the United States and the Soviet Union and Great Britain all mobilized every aspect of the economy, and in a way that I think Jonathan referred to the New Deal as being not enough, which I completely agree with, in a way that actually was inclusive and was the double victory for African Americans and for Rosie the Riveter and women in America. So it certainly is a tool, and it's a description of what governance can do. And I think when there's the void that I spoke of, that liberalism ascribes, what can fill that void can look like, inclusive leftist full employment movements, or it can look like exclusive neo-fascist movements.
In the back.
Yeah, so this is for Peter. So in yours, you talk a lot about freedom. So I want to move away from Locke and move more towards like Nietzsche and existentialism and how they define morality in more individual terms, and how it's more about the choices of individuals and how they align and how they view their world. But while money is also still a public good, and we understand like the power relations that are brought about in postmodernism. So how do you balance those things out in your eyes when it comes to money? How do you balance out the fact that money is a public good, but it's also used for choice, right? So we use it to show our choices. That's how we do preferences, things like that. So we need it to express what we want is important in this world. But we also need it to deal with the issues that are in the system.
Thanks. So I would say two things in response. The first is, I don't think there's anything in what I've said that is incompatible with also understanding money as a public good. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's one element of the response. The other element would be to maybe give you a little bit more of a precise interpretation of what I mean by freedom. Right? So one of the objections I actually omitted in the presentation, because there's only so much time, is that someone might say, are you kidding me? Money means freedom? Or especially money created through credit, right? I mean, that means people who have debt are freer than others, right? And there's, of course, lots of counterexamples in our economy, and I would immediately concede that for some, money created through debt is the opposite of freedom. It binds them to paying the debt back, right? And so there I make a distinction between, well, it depends on what you get the credit for, right? If you're forced by your socioeconomic situation to get credit for basic healthcare, education, and so on, then money is not freedom in the sense that I've understood it here. Right? Money as freedom in the sense that I've understood it here is when you can use the collateral that you have, as opposed to not have, to enhance the choices that you can make as an individual. Right? And so even the cases of where money creation favors or biases the system in favor of banks ultimately can be reduced to some individuals rather than others having more choices open to them in the economy. So that's the aspect of freedom I'm focusing on. But again, I don't see anything that is incompatible here with also understanding money as a public good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. First comment for Maxximilian. Your paper, you may want to look at the Gold cases with FDR when he was threatening to pack the Supreme Court. This is dealing with the gold standard, and the final case dealt with a gentleman loaned gold, a certain amount of gold to the government, and he wanted gold plus X number of ounces of gold back. You may want to look at the dissent of that. So they ruled that no, the government could just take away that gold and give you dollar bills and say that that's the equivalent. And the dissent basically said that if you do this, that's the end of private property in America. So actually, for everybody here, it actually informs what is money, and can it ever be democratic, because it is at the end of private property, and the argument in the dissent goes into that. And Peter, I think you heard my question at the beginning of the session today, as far as I asked, as far as the first receivers of money get to buy goods at a discount, and I was very happy someone to mention Cantillon effect. I was wondering if I was ever going to hear those words at this conference. But still, in your system, you have 100% banking, and you do have in the past where the banks would actually pay equity, and this is where commercial banking comes from, is that they would pay the depositors a percentage of that and pay them interest and give them a cut on the investments that they made. So you did have that in the U.S. I don't know if you're aware of that, but even in your system that you advocate, the government has to decide who gets that money first. So if you're the government and you're going to decide a contract between the three of us, right? It's you, the government bureaucrats, the experts, the deciders, who get to decide which one of us get to buy that. And I don't think that your paper or at least your presentation didn't cover that. And I'm kind of curious as to how you cover that now.
Okay, so first thing I want to say is when you say your system that you advocate,
I'm advocating
yeah, so
system.
no, I mean me, right?
Oh, yeah.
So maybe I presented it that way, but in the paper I want to really put the emphasis on the diagnosis. Look, there is these distributive biases, right? And here's a menu of things of what we can do. I'm careful not to endorse one of them. I'm not saying we should go for 100% banking. I'm saying, look, we can point to these things as possible solutions for this problem, but the problem is the main thing.
Right, and you get to that. I think you eliminate a lot of the distributive bias, but there's one that you don't mention, and that's the one.
And that's the yeah. So where I completely agree with you that even if we take commercial banks out of the equation, right, there will still be money creation. There will just be one money creator, and that's the central bank, right? And so the money supply will grow, right? And then the question, especially if you have the Cantillon effect at the back of your mind, the question is still, well, who are the primary beneficiaries of the money that is being created by the central bank? So for instance, if we had a Green New Deal and we would, we could even do that in the current system, under QE, we could buy green bonds rather than a neutral sample of the market, which is not neutral anyway. Right? So these are, I agree, these are political decisions. Right? But that's where I agree with Scott. We should treat them as political decisions, right? Today that we give them to central banks and say, oh no, this is technocratic expertise, but there's all kinds of hidden political choices that are in there, right? So we need to bring these out in the open. Yeah.
Does somebody have a question for Jonathan? Not right now?
Sure.
You did?
In terms of your citizen assembly example, you mentioned Iceland and Ireland. Have there been sort of smaller scale, maybe municipality level type examples that have involved either municipal budgeting or some sort of control of money at the community level?
Yeah, these have been done around the world. One particular example I find particularly fascinating, because you don't think if this is where it would be occurring, is in China. James Fishkin, who's a professor who has a center that specializes in this kind of activity, actually does municipal budgeting at the municipal level within China. And so they randomly pick people from the municipality. they actually first poll the existing party elite as to how they intend to spend the money. Then they randomly pick people in municipalities in China. They deliberate, they hear different kinds of proposals of how the money could be spent. Then they come up with how they want the budget to be spent. And it's always different than what was initially set. And then that's then implemented. And this has been done in pilot type projects, and there's potential for expanding, but this has been done there. And it's been done other places around the world. So it could be, so I think this is something that could be done, like could be replicated in other municipalities. Jackson, Mississippi has something that I've only recently heard about, but it's not a full citizen assembly as in like randomly selected, but it's a mayor doing public policy and budget setting through popular like town hall type inputs. But I think this kind of thing could be done across municipalities.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Thank you. Yes, Scott mentioned earlier that the problem that we really have is overcoming ignorance. Is the fact that money is not taught. How about the fact that Larry Summers was the president of this university, and there was never a course here on money. When I say money, I mean the monetary system. That's what we're talking about, is the monetary system. We're not talking about money in banking, or capital, or anything like that. We're talking about money. We're talking about the public money. We're talking about so that overcoming that ignorance requires some kind of massive steps. To mention reserve banking, full reserve banking. If you create the money, there was no reserves when we created the greenbacks. There was no reserves. So read Dr. Joseph Huber's book on sovereign money beyond reserve banking. Start there, because there's no need to have a discussion about reserves. As far as the morality of capitalism, what's going on with capitalism today, I'm just going to suggest a little bit of homework, which is Hyman Minsky is one of the papers that we never talk about. Never ever talk about Hyman Minsky's paper number 127, which is titled Financial Instability and the Decline of Banking, Public Policy Implications, in which he identifies the problems of capitalism. And we've talked about them a little bit. We've touched on them a little bit, which is they create their money and then they determine the capital development of the economy. That's the superpower of capitalism. And if we don't recognize that that's the superpower of capitalism, there's no way we'll be able to deal with the immorality that comes out of it. He did suggest that the way to get to solving it is for a national monetary commission. So that's one of the things that I would say. What do you people think about moving towards a national monetary commission? That we overcome the ignorance first, and then we start to put the solutions in place.
Anybody want to take this on?
So on the ignorance, there's so many interpretations, right? And so even if I take it on myself to educate the public about money, what I would say is that I believe might really not be what other people believe. So I think somehow we are in the process of developing a critique and getting to what democratic money might look like. I'm pessimistic personally because I think capitalism is in the way, but others seem to be more optimistic. But I think that's the problem.
Maybe one addition, I mean, to have that debate, we need to have it in the education of economists. I mean, Jamie mentioned it earlier, in the education of neoclassical economists, I studied economics, I never heard about money. For 4 years, I've never heard about money. Right? So in order to get over our disagreements, economists need to learn. I have economics colleagues who I told about these projects, and they say, I don't know how money's created in a modern economy.
But there's a reason for that, though. There's a reason, because neoclassical economics thinks it's a veil and everything.
There's no money in neoclassical economics, it's all barter.
Yeah.
Problem. Problem.
Well, we're out of time. If you have more questions, you can come and speak to our panelists. Help me thank them with a